Hello everyone, welcome back to the part 3 of the 3-part special for Zanette's Place, who requested I cover the Infiltrator specifically with a focus towards conversion to Pierce, specifically Elemental. Now I have covered my favorite ranged build, which uses a two-handed ranged weapon Messenger's Repeater, and I covered a couple of melee builds in part 2. In part 3, I'm going to be discussing the items that Zanette's Place specifically mentioned that they were looking to use. Alright, this is going to be a bit of a shorter episode because I'm going to be very specifically focusing on 3 items here. I will clarify why 3 in a bit. But because I've already laid the groundwork here, this is more going to be adjustments to the previous 2 parts. So first off, the crux here, and of the 3 items I'm going to be talking about, but this is the constant. Thor's head, specifically the mythical one. This is fairly interesting because not only does it increase pierce damage, but it also increases bleeding damage, converts some chaos damage to piercing damage, and of course some cold damage to piercing damage. It also gives a faster recharge on Phantasmal Blades and converts Phantasmal Blades' vitality damage to pierce damage, which is really nice. We also have, which is really quite lovely, the +3 to deadly aim, which helps us with our Phantasmal Nova because that procs off of crits. And of course, deadly aim increases offensive ability, which in turn increases the likelihood we will land critical hits, which is of course what we want. Now, a word of caution really quickly, in order to get a really, really good one of these, it might take some farming, because if you get on the lower end of this, you're going to see less of your cold damage being converted, which is unfortunate. So possibly a couple of farming attempts might get you one that gets you 50% or close to it, because the Oathbearer converts the same percentage but elemental damage and has the same randomness, right? The Mythical Oathbearer also has 100% armor piercing, which is of course really nice for a pierce build. Also increases pierce and bleeding, but it only increases the aura of conviction and gives it bleeding effects, which generally speaking, while we can use it as our secondary damage type, and in fact we typically will be, this can get a little bit interesting. So, let's talk turkey. Now, running very specifically the Oathbearer, this gives us some great things to work with. First off, again, I'm going to assume we're going to be lucky and match the 100% conversion of Messenger's Repeater. Okay, we're just going to make that assumption here. So, obviously we would want chilling rounds with this, and of course because the Oathbearer increases aura of conviction, right, we would want this, which of course increases our pierce damage, which is lovely, but we also get some bleed damage out of this. And because Thor's head increases deadly aim, and we want those crits, we will once again be looking to increase deadly aim. Now from here, we would of course also want Phantasmal Blades. Now how far you want to go with Phantasmal Blades is going to be the burning question. Heartseeker is totally fine. Definitely at minimum go up to Heartseeker. Okay, we are looking at an increasing in our bleeding damage, which of course we enhance. As mentioned earlier, the vitality damage of Phantasmal Blades is being converted here, so this vitality damage becomes pierce damage. It's also really important to note, by the way, just as a side note in case you didn't know, this frenetic throw here, when it converts the piercing damage to vitality damage, you can't convert that back. Each damage type can only be converted once. Once you've converted a damage type, it cannot be converted a second time. So don't get Frenetic Throw and think that that vitality damage will reconvert back to piercing damage because you've got Thor's head. That is unfortunately not how this works. Alright, but you absolutely should be running Phantasmal Blades, absolutely should be running Heartseeker. Whether or not you go for Nether Edge would be a personal preference. It does increase your crit damage, which again we are going to some extent be covering. I personally would recommend against this. This is a lot of point investment here. This is another 17 points here just to get to Nether Edge. And even then, the Chaos and Cold damage, while the Cold damage will be converted 100%, The chaos damage is only going to be converted anywhere from, and I'm rounding here, 1/3 to 1/2 of that chaos damage. So this is going to be down to more personal preference. Again, I wouldn't recommend it just due to the rather egregious point investment you would require to get to here, but it is absolutely worth getting to Heartseeker, 100%. Again, we also can grab, while we're here, Veil of Shadow and Night's Chill. Very, very useful. Now, this also gives us the really great option of going either Pneumatic Burst or with Word of Renewal. This is going to be down to your personal preference. Once again, in this particular case, because Pneumatic Burst specifically increases your total speed, okay, I would recommend slightly Pneumatic Burst because you are also going to get slightly more benefits, right? You're going to get this chance to avoid projectiles, you're going to get this chance to avoid melee, you're going to get reduced entrapment, you of course again have that total speed increase, and you have an increase in offensive ability here, while you also have an increase in offensive ability, this is defensive ability, the offensive ability is later on, that's on Steel Resolve, pardon me, I had them flipped in my head. So, for the primary reasons of increasing total speed, the increase in offensive ability, and this being generally useful across the board, especially in hardcore or with boosted enemy stats, over Word of Renewal, right? Which does have the flat health restoration, does have the ability, defensive ability increase, has the movement speed, but it doesn't increase your attacks. This does, of course, mimic the entrapment. It's got that very similar thing going on there, but it also just increases more flat health, which, while nice, is just going to ultimately match up with the Pneumatic Burst, ultimately. Again, this is personal preference, according to you, whichever one you prefer, because Word of Arms you can't run because you are using a single-hand pistol, and because you aren't dual-wielding melee weapons, you can't run Breath of Bolgothian, so this is going to be, again, strictly down to your preference. And, of course, because we are converting that cold damage 100%, you absolutely can get Rune of Hagrad, as we would with the Messenger's Repeater as well. Again, Chill Surge is totally optional. I personally like it. We can, of course, get the famous Horn of Gandar as well. And then at this point, I mean, even if you get Chill Surge... excuse me, I almost forgot we need ranged expertise. But even if you get Chill Surge, you still are kicking around with 15 points that you can use for whatever. You can throw them into Phantasmal Armor. You can throw them into Artifact Handling to increase the damage and decrease the recharge time of Rune of Hagrad. You can absolutely do that. You'll notice because we don't have the Messenger's Repeater converting that elemental damage, we aren't touching Word of Pain, which is totally fine. But you do have these, you get this 15 points that you can play around with as you wish. And you can go ham, right? Absolutely. For Devotion, there's not really a whole lot that I would change off of the Messenger's Repeater build here for the Devotion for this. Again, we're still running the Assassin's Blade, but I would more aggressively recommend the Falcon Swoop, because that is going to be bleeding damage, which, of course, you are increasing to some extent anyways, and it is going to wind up being your secondary damage source. But, of course, between the Nightblade and the Inquisitor, there's not a whole lot of... Pardon me. There's not a whole lot of bleeding damage between the two of them that you can easily increase. But we can get it out of our constellations. You, of course, again, have the Falcon Swoop. You can also get Shifting Sands for the piercing damage. Or if you really want to emphasize that bleeding damage, you can go for the Living Shadow as well. Now, keep in mind that we have a really nice boost to our offensive ability due to the simple fact... Let me actually show you really quick. If only I could spell. I just want to slap the items in here so you can actually see. I still can't spell, apparently. Alright. This is fine. Alright, we're just going to have to... There we go. Equip that. And then the offhand, this is going to be Jaren Thor. There it is. I just want you to see the boost here. Again, these items specifically. Which one of these is giving us the plus 1 to Inquisitor, plus 1 to Nightblade? So these balance out for plus 1 to each, right? Which is really nice. So we get a plus 1 to all of these. We get a plus 1 to all of these. And of course, we have a huge benefit. You can see a 20% increase in offensive ability, which is really, really nice. Right? We can also, of course, get even more out of this. Right? You're getting a little bit more damage modified. You're getting a little... Actually, no, it's just a crit damage for that one. The damage modified increases the next round. But you are, of course, getting a bit more damage out of these. Of course, we're converting that cold damage. It's just very effective. But going back to the devotion, we can pull a really nice amount of bleeding damage right out of the constellations, okay? Which is where you're going to be getting a lot of your bleed damage from anyways. Again, I really like the Falcon for this. You can very easily incorporate that. There's really, outside of strongly recommending the Falcon, and a bit more emphasis on the Living Shadow, because, again, you do have a little bit more offensive ability increases here, so the Living Shadows are going to be a little bit more consistent in coming out. This is actually going to be a much more effective summon for you than it normally would be. So, I mean, if you're fighting people at range, they're still going to have to travel across that way, but they are going to be a really great way of keeping melee enemies off of you for a little while. So, unlike with the Messenger's Repeater, where I didn't really recommend Living Shadow as an option, it is actually a much stronger option here. Okay? So, that is the Oathbearer. Again, this is more of a modified version of the Messenger's Repeater, and when I talked about the Messenger's Repeater build, I very specifically mentioned that I don't like using the Phantasmal Blades there because I already have a ranged weapon. But in this particular build here, because the Oathbearer, as piercing as it is, does substantially less damage, this actually still works out as a really strong ranged option, especially since once you get Heartseeker, you have that punch through, right? And because this, unlike with the Messenger's Repeater, which wasn't converting that vitality damage and it wasn't really worth getting to Heartseeker, with the Oathbearer and Jarnthor's Head, this is significantly more worthwhile because that vitality damage is becoming piercing. So you are getting more benefit out of this than you would with the Messenger's Repeater. And again, because you are running a pistol, which, while doing respectable piercing damage, isn't going to be anything you're going to write home about, this will be your absolute blast of ranged damage, which everyone appreciates, right? And again, if you really wanted to, you could get this first stage of Amarasta's Blade Burst with your remaining 15 points. Alright, that cold damage is going to be converted to piercing damage. I don't personally recommend it. This is scaling off of weapon damage, which of course is... You're running a single-hand pistol. It's going to be very low. Alright, so it is an option if you really want it. Just be aware of the fact that unlike the Rune of Hagarad, which doesn't care what weapon you're using and therefore does really well with the pistol, the Amarasta's Blade Burst does, to some extent, pull some of its damage off of your weapons. So just be aware of that when you decide. That's why I strongly recommend Rune of Hagarad even more than I would with the Messenger's Repeater. The Messenger's Repeater, at least as a two-handed gun, is going to be still doing respectable damage with Amarasta's Blade Burst, but that is not the case here, because again, you are using that pistol. So, again, Devotion, pretty similar to what I talked about with the Messenger's Repeater, but a higher emphasis on Falcon Swoop, a higher emphasis on the Living Shadow. Obviously, you still will want the Assassin's Mark, of course. You also, by the way, this is something I didn't talk about with either of the other two builds, but you could very easily grab the Huntress here. Alright? And that would be fairly easy to get by simply going over here, grabbing the green, right? And then we would have the 4. You would need 3 red, which is fairly easy to grab, where you could very simply... Well, you've got 2 options. You could go with the Mantis, which is going to give you pierce damage. It is only going to be 4. It's going to give you some purple. This is what I recommend. Alright, and then you're going to get that 3. You can go over here, grab the Huntress, grab all of this lovely bleeding damage, get the Rend, which reduces enemies' bleeding resistance, which will help your constellations. This is optional. I just want to be very clear here. This is optional. You don't need this. It's just a nice to have. But you can get the Huntress here and not really have that much of a strong problem still getting to, say, the Unknown Soldier or Azraka, right? Because at this particular point, you would be able to run the Harpy. And there we go. We would have the 15 here. We would have the 12 here. And then you would just need a little bit more yellow, which we could easily do the Lion, right? And then we just need some blue, which, of course, we can grab either the Lizard and keep this blue here, right? Or, alternatively, we drop this blue, and we go for either the Eel, which is going to... the Eel is going to be a little bit nicer in conjunction with the Shadow Dance, by the way, because it is going to increase that dodge chance, so that is fairly fun. So for this example, I'm going to pull the Eel, alright? We're pretty close to this as well. Go ahead and grab at least these. Leave the Shifting Sands be for now. Go for some more yellow here. What do we feel like getting? No, get out of there. Let me see here. We could... No, I don't think that's a good idea. Let's think about this. We could just get the Stag. Actually, we could theoretically get the Stag instead of the Eel, to be honest. Which is going to increase our bleeding damage. That might actually be more effective. Oh, there we go. And then we can very easily get the Unknown Soldier here. You can still do the Eel and just do, say, the Dryad. You can see I have 6 points left over here. Well, 5 points technically left over here. So it's very easy to do, say, the Dryad instead. Not really that big of an issue. Again, you could also grab the Lotus here instead. That would be very easy to do. Get some extra healing benefit. You could go down here and grab the Harvestman's Scythe. Also a great option there, right? You wouldn't be able to actually finish it. You'd be just shy of the increased health and energy unless you pulled out a point from somewhere else. For example, maybe you dropped this, grabbed this, and then you dropped one of these points here. Say this is blue, right? Yep, you could drop the blue here and then put that here, right? Very easy to do, but you can very capably get all of these. Again, I didn't do Shifting Sands, but that would be a really easy adjustment. And we still have the Rend here, of course, 20% chance on attack, which works out really nicely, by the way, with Phantasmal Blades, because each one of these blades that hits is going to have a 20% chance of blasting out a Rend. Okay? So when you're running Rend, if you choose to use Rend, this is really, really nice on Phantasmal Blades. This is one of my favorite things to use it on. For the Shadows, I typically like to blast this on Horn of Gandar, because this is, again, that AoE around you, which is when you're going to want Shadows in the first place, so that's just a really nice thing to have, especially since you're, again, given your higher offensive ability, and assuming you're under the influence of Deadly Aim at this particular point, the chances of you getting 3 crits to grab 3 living Shadows to defend you in your hour of need is pretty good, actually. And then, of course, we have the Falcon Swoop, which, as always, we love to put on Rune of Hagrad. And you can absolutely put the Assassin's Mark on the Chilling rounds, right? You can also swap this with the Rune of Hagrad as well if you really want to. If you really want that Assassin's Mark. In fact, if you're doing hardcore or you're running a mod that boosts the stats of your enemies, then it probably would be a smarter idea to swap Rune of Hagrad, put the Assassin's Mark on Rune of Hagrad, because it's very important you'll get that Pierce resistance, and put the Falcons on Chilling rounds, excuse me, and use the Falcon Swoop with that, just for some bonus bleed damage on your Chilling shots. So you can see, outside of an adjustment to possibly grab the Huntress here if you choose to take her on, which, again, is very easy to work in here, there's really not much difference to the Messenger's Repeater build. So I just wanted to talk about that really quick, but what I also wanted to talk about really quick, the third item that I wanted to talk about, was a melee alternative if you didn't want to use the Oathbearer, or if you're like me, you decided you didn't want to use the Oathbearer and you wanted something else. Now, the melee item that is somewhat similar to the Oathbearer is the Nocturne. Alright, this also converts cold damage at roughly the same rate as, actually the exact same rate as Jaren Thor's head, right? So we do have that. We have piercing damage here. As you'll probably notice, there are a couple of problems. First, we don't have full 100% piercing. We only have 40%, but we do have a higher weapon damage. Alright, we still have an increase to deadly aim, which is really nice. We have an increase to shadow strike, alright, which also gains additional piercing damage, and anytime deadly aim is active, we get 6% physical resistance. So, between Oathbearer or Nocturne, besides the differences I'm about to talk about, Nocturne is going to be a little bit easier. Well, I say a little bit easier to survive. The truth is that this physical resistance is just going to compensate for the fact that you're going to be in melee range at all times, right? But let's talk about this with the Nocturne instead. Again, just so you have a melee alternative in case you decide you don't want the ranged. Alright, so we're going to go on ahead and, again, Pneumatic Burst, between Pneumatic Burst or Word of Renewal, that is totally down to your preference. You'll notice that the Nocturne, unlike the Oathbearer, which gives us +1 to all skills in Inquisitor, the Nocturne does not, which is a disadvantage of Nocturne. We also lose Chilling Rounds, and I also, of course, we don't have ranged expertise as well, either. And the Rune of Hagarad is just not as effective under this, right? Phantasmal Blades remains effective. But what we would want to do in this particular case is go on ahead and, at minimum, run Amaras's Blade Burst, and, of course, Shadow Strike is something we really want. We're, of course, assuming we are converting 100% of that cold damage, and we can, of course, also grab Nidala's Justifiable Ends, because the Nocturne very specifically does increase Nidala's Justifiable Ends. Now, while this is a melee version of the build, this is unfortunate in that this is doing poison damage and beyond, making that recharge much faster. Very specifically, we're going from a 3.5 down to a 2.2, which is really nice. At the end of the day, we are going to have a problem with we're not really boosting a whole lot of poison damage here. Now, this does open up the very interesting and odd potential for grabbing Lethal Assault. I don't recommend it because it's still doing acid damage, which you're not increasing, and that increase to cold and frostburn damage doesn't matter to you because you're converting the cold damage. So there is that. This does, although, offer you the Ring of Steel, right? And of course, we have a slightly more powerful weapon. The Nocturne increases it does a bit more damage here. For comparison, we have 77 max here, we have 138 max here. In fact, its minimum is higher than the Oathbearer. So we do have that. That is part of the reason why Amaras's Blade Burst is a little bit more conducive here. This actually just is going to be hitting a little bit harder than it would with the Oathbearer. Same thing with the Ring of Steel. So you do have those options as well. Of course, if you really want to, you can keep the Rune of Hagarad. It's just that in the face of Shadow Strike, there's not really going to be a whole lot of enemies running over this rune. There just isn't going to be. Okay? You're just going to be in melee almost all the time, especially since this is going to be on a 2.2 cooldown. So it's kind of like, why would I need to, run over to someone when I can just basically teleport over there, throw some Phantasmal Blades at somebody who else is ranged, or throw Phantasmal Blades through the person I just teleported to, and then just finish them off, right? A wombo combo of Shadow Strike and Phantasmal Blades is going to hit a lot of enemies very, very hard, especially if you followed up with a Ring of Steel, Horn of Gandar combo, like I talked about with some of the other builds here, specifically the melee builds. So you do have all of these options. Again, this is just a melee version. Frankly, the Oathbearer is going to be slightly more consistent, in my opinion, primarily due to the fact that you do have the slight increase to these skills. You do have access to Chilling Rounds, which is converting that cold damage. You are, of course, having access to that Rune of Hagarad. There's really not much other change. In fact, in terms of the constellations, I wouldn't really change anything. Although, I will say, for the constellations here, the devotion points, The Huntress is much less important because, unlike with the Oathbearer, which is also increasing your bleeding damage, Nocturne is increasing your cold damage, despite the fact that you are converting your cold damage out of cold into pierce, which somewhat contrasts with the stated goals here, right? But nevertheless, I just wanted to put this out here as a somewhat similar melee weapon to the melee version of Oathbearer. There are obviously some differences here, but I just wanted to have that out there so that way, again, if you tire of the Oathbearer or you want to try something a little different, or you just happen to get the Nocturne first, because neither the Nocturne nor the Oathbearer, the mythical Oathbearer, neither of these are tied to a specific enemy. These are just going to randomly show up when you start getting to the 90s, right? So you may get the Oathbearer first, you may get the Nocturne first, you may not see them for decades. That's an exaggeration, obviously, but nevertheless, I just wanted to throw this out there so that way if it's taking you a while to get the Oathbearer and you get a Nocturne, at the very least it'll be an acceptable substitute, or maybe you find through experimentation you prefer the Nocturne over the Oathbearer because it fits more with your style. Or maybe you just use this temporarily until you do get the Oathbearer. Whatever winds up happening, I just wanted to have this here as a sort of, well, here's something you can use in the meantime if you want, or something to experiment with, right? But with that being said, that is going to conclude the examination of element piercing builds for the Infiltrator. I was going to call it the Inquisitor. Inquisitor was stuck in my brain. I know it was wrong, but the Infiltrator. I almost did it again. But anyways, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.